First, remove the factory skid plate. Step 1. Install the front skid plate bracket. Bracket screw holes. Align the bracket holes with the cross-member holes. Secure the bracket with 1030 fine thread screws and 1025 washers. Start the bolts by hand first. Avoid wrong bolts damaging the original threads. The other hole is the same. Align with the chassis holes. Secure the bracket with 1030 fine thread screws and 1025 washers. These two spots on the original car aren't threaded. Add 2 M10 nut strips. Measure how far the nut strip goes in from here. Bend the nut strip to fit. Easier to insert. Insert the nut strip here. Align the front skid plate bracket holes. Secure the bracket with 10x30 screws and 10x25 washers. The side hole is the same. Install an M10 nut strip. Secure the bracket with standard 1030 serrated bolts and 1025 washers. Align the bracket to the cross member. Then tighten the bolts with an impact wrench. Then trim the excess nut strip. Tuck it in the cross member. Step 2. Install the rear skid plate bracket. Bracket bolt holes. Secure the bracket with the before installing nuts. The rear skid plate bracket. First, remove the 2 nuts from the cross member. We'll reuse the original nuts later to install the bracket. Remove the inner cross member nut. Align the rear bracket's 2 holes with the factory bolts. Reuse the factory nuts to secure the rear skid plate bracket. Then align the bracket with the cross member. Tighten bolts with an air wrench. Now let's install the first plate. The 2 inner front holes line up with the original chassis holes. Secure the skid plate with M10X30 fine thread bolts and 10x25 washers. Start the bolts by hand to avoid damaging the original threads. The 4 rear holes line up with the front bracket screw holes. Secure the skid plate with M10X30 bolts and 10x25 washers. Hand start the bolts to avoid thread damage. Don't tighten the bolts yet. Secure the front side holes of the skid plate with M12X30 fine thread bolts and 12x30 washers. Hand start the bolts to avoid using the wrong ones and damaging the original threads. Secure the skid plate with M12X30 fine thread bolts and 12x30 washers. The 2 front holes on the skid plate line up with the bracket screw holes. Secure with M10X30 bolts and 10x25 washers. Start the bolts by hand to avoid thread damage. The rear skid plate holes line up with the original chassis screw holes. Secure with M10X30 fine thread bolts and 10x25 washers. Start the bolts by hand first to avoid damaging the threads. We need this hole for the skid plate, so let's remove this bolt first. The 3 front skid plate holes line up with our bracket holes. Secure with M10X30 standard bolts and 10x25 washers. Hand start the bolts to avoid wrong thread damage. Don't tighten the bolts yet. The rear side hose line up with the original chassis bolt hose. Secure it with 10x30 fine thread screws and 10x25 washers. Start the bolts by hand to avoid cross-threading. There are no threads here on the chassis, so add an M8 strip nut. Align the nut with the rear center hole of the skid plate. Secure the guard plate with M8X30 screws and M8X25 washers. Don't tighten the bolts yet. Use this hole for the 4th skid plate.
First, take out this screw.
Now install the 4th plate. The 2 front skid plate holes line up with the factory screw holes. Secure it with M1030 fine thread bolts and M1025 washers. Hand start the bolts. Avoid wrong bolts, damaging the original threads. Same here. Secure it with M1030 fine thread bolts and M1025 washers. There are no threads here from the factory. Add an M8 nut strip. Measure how far the nut strip goes in from here. Bend the nut strip to shape. Insert the nut strip here. Align with the skid plate hole. Secure the skid plate with MM30 bolts and MM825 washers. Thread the bolts by hand. Prevents wrong bolts from damaging the threads. Same here on the skid plate. Bend the nut strip to shape. Insert the nut strip here and line it up with the skid plate hole. Secure the skid plate with M830 bolts and M825 washers. Thread the bolts by hand. Avoid the wrong screw to prevent. There are no threads here on the stock chassis. We install an M8 nut strip here. Bend the nut strip to shape, then insert it here. Fasten it with an 8x30 standard screw and an 8x25 washer. Hand start the screw. Avoid wrong screws damaging threads. Adjust the spacing between the skid plates. Then tighten all the skid plate screws. Finally, trim the extra metal strip. Then hide the metal strip. Installation complete.